working, so
okay.
I can take over from here.
Yes,
So
it'll be working fine now.
yeah. So as Ord said, this is actually some information, some research that we've done in response to a request from the World Bank, actually putting together a study looking at the need for spectrum policy changes in times of emergency to create resilient networks to serve the needs of consumers, and not just of consumers but also PPDR as well. So as I said, the overall idea of the study was to have kind of quite a wide range of topics, and we did this by looking at case studies in a lot of cases. A lot of regulators made changes to spectrum policy as COVID came in, but of course it's not just as COVID came in, but also there's a lot of work done in the background on PPDR questions as well, and how is that evolving over time. I'm not going to touch on PPDR in this session, but it's suffice to say that it's obviously a very important thing that if you do make any changes to spectrum policy to cope with a kind of a medium-term emergency like COVID, you don't take away spectrum that the emergency services might need to actually react to it. And obviously the key question that came out of the overall study was, what can we learn for next time? Are there specific things that regulators should start to do to prepare for any future pandemic, and making sure that the telecoms industry can actually support the country and the population. So let's start off by talking about internet access generally. And the graph that you can see on this slide is one that you will no doubt have seen many times before. There is a very large and fast increase in demand for telecom services, and you can see that here we've split it out between fixed and mobile, and then sort of managed IP services, so things like leased lines and so on, to see where the traffic is coming from and what it's being driven by. And in the report that we've put together, then we've cut this by a number of ways as well, looking at the types of traffic that are being carried, and also splitting it by different geographic regions and countries and so on. But the key thing to say is that overall you have a very large increase in demand pretty much consistently. Now, one thing to note here is that this data was actually put together in 2020, so the figures for 2021 and for 2022 are estimates. And when I say that it's put together in 2020, I'm talking about early 2020, before any pandemic effect was thought about. So although we've got numbers here for 2021 and 2022 which are obviously much higher than the previous years, in actual fact, it's very likely that those numbers are going to be much higher in reality. But in any case, the important thing to take away from this is that over time, so I've just had a message from Claire Milne saying that she cannot see a presentation, which is obviously not ideal. Let me just try switching off and on again and just see if that fixes it. Order, can you confirm that you can see the presentation?
Yes, I can.
Okay. And okay, a couple of other people said that they can see it as well.
Yeah.
We will be able to send out the presentation to anyone who's registered afterwards. So I will try and describe what is on the slides, just so that you can be aware. So on this on the slide that I've got at the moment, it's a standard graph from Cisco showing how the demand for traffic has gone up over time. The main points to make are that mobile operators and fixed line operators, and just generally the telecoms industry, is used to adapting themselves and making sure that they are serving increasing demand. And it's not just the size of the demand, but also there's an increasing need for reliability and speed. The largest share of data traffic has always been, and is increasingly so, video. So the the networks have been built around that and have been adapting for that. But there is a difference between the video demands that was there before and then what happened in early 2020. So what happened when COVID hit was that there was a massive change in the nature of demand. There's a quote from one of the regulators that I've put here that says that as COVID-19 spread, our network saw massively changing demands due to lockdowns and communication needs. And we had a look and we talked to a number of regulators, a number of operators about what the main issues were. And I've listed them here, and just to go through them one by one. The biggest change that people talked about was the change in the time of day and geographic location of data demands. I mean, obviously, people were not travelling into cities, and generally we had the largest demand was always during the day in cities and in evenings in suburban areas. That swapped around, well, not swapped around, it completely changed during the day. The networks which had been dimensioned to hold massive traffic in city centres were suddenly massively underutilised, whereas those in suburban areas saw a much greater use. We also saw an increased use of fixed networks instead of mobile. I'll show you a demonstration of that in a moment, but the key thing here is that the fixed networks were not available everywhere, and there were lots of countries around the world where mobile is by far almost the only form of communication. I remember reading a report saying that there were something like only 11,000 fixed lines in Tanzania, showing that mobile is basically the lifeline for internet access there. There was a demand for better connections, and when I say better, I'm talking about faster and more reliable. And this is because people were starting to rely on them for work, they were starting to rely on them for socializing. Suddenly, a lot of your life moved online, and you needed to make sure you had a reliable connection for that. As part of the work, there was an increased use of video conferencing and other office applications. And I mentioned before about how video was the largest driver of traffic previously. Two-way video suddenly became a lot more important during 2020 and 2021. And there was a changing use of voice and direct messaging. And this is talking about kind of traditional voice calls and so on. Again, partially there was a large increase because of the need for people to be kind of kept at home, but at the same time people were moving over to video calls on a personal basis as well as for work. So that saw a kind of a shifting in the way that that the demand was being felt. And I mentioned about mobile and fixed having different profiles, and you may not be able to see all the detail of this. As I said, you'll get a copy of these slides, and I'm not sure, Ord, if it's possible to send out a copy of the slides now so that people like Claire are able to access them.
Yeah, I just sent a copy to Claire.
Great. Oh, great. Okay. If anyone else cannot see the slides, then please let us know and we can send you an email straight away. But you'll be able to see this afterwards. And as I said, it's in our report, and it's also I've put the source on here so you can see more detail behind it. But one of the things that we saw was that there are very large differences in the way that services saw their demand changing. The biggest increase was actually for online gaming, which saw a 5-fold increase, a 400% increase in demand. VPNs, obviously with people working from home and wanting to connect into their office networks, more than doubled in size. Live TV streaming went up by 70%. And each of these services obviously requires a different type of network and different characteristics. Online gaming requires low latency more than anything else. TV streaming doesn't really require the latency, but it does require large bandwidth. And we did see that people moved in the first instance to fixed networks, and the graph at the bottom of this slide kind of illustrates this. This is for developed countries in Europe and in in the US, we basically saw that you've got a 30% growth across the entirety of 2019 in fixed traffic. It's kind of quite steady. And then within a few days of lockdown occurring, then you had a 20% growth in fixed data traffic. It was a massive increase, whereas mobile traffic actually went down. Now there's an increased bandwidth for traffic at all times of the day, but particularly during the day in suburban areas. But as I said earlier, the urban question, the urban areas were the dense city centres were not being used as much. So there's this immediate and rapid change to the way that demand was being felt, and operators felt that they needed to do something about this. And in many cases, they turned to the regulator and asked for some help. So how did regulators respond to this? Lots of ways, lots of different ways. And I've put down a few of the general policies here. This is meant to be a presentation about spectrum, but I wanted to kind of quickly talk about some of the other ways that regulators did respond. First of all, they worked with operators to try and increase broadband speeds and actually provide broadband speeds at a higher level to people without having kind of additional payments and so on. A number of regulators were working with operators to provide fee services to customers who otherwise wouldn't have a service. Very quickly, new fixed wireless access networks were put together so that there could be increased capacity and also connecting people who are otherwise unconnected. There was more flexible spectrum use, and I will come on to that shortly. Regulators also discussed with operators how best to manage the networks in terms of not just ensuring that there was enough capacity on the network, but also how did networks work together. So we saw some examples of where the operators were encouraged to work together to carry capacity and make sure that the networks were holding up. There were government subsidised broadband services, again similar to the FWA networks and providing free services, but also in some countries where the telecom networks are less privatised, more nationalised, and there was more subsidy poured into those. I'll come to the one on the bottom left in a moment. There was an applicant for tracking applications. This is where the health services identified what sort of connectivity they needed and how should that all be run through. Things like the tracing systems that you saw in many European countries and in America and so on. Regulators also moved on to the content side and were looking at the fake news around COVID-19 and making sure that social networks and so on had the responsibility to tackle that. And then the last point, the easing regulatory and competition requirements point. This was a very interesting one because we saw in a number of places that operators were effectively encouraged to work together to divide up where they were going to be kind of investing to make sure that everyone was having kind of proper coverage, to make sure that they were not competing in an inefficient way. And we saw in a couple of cases there was an explicit requirement for competition law to be relaxed for the period to make sure that to make sure that make sure that operators were not being kind of unfairly or punished because they were trying to act for the best outcome for consumers. So I just had a message saying there's a toolbox, but I don't have a toolbox on the screen, so I'm not sure what that refers to. So these are kind of the general policies. These are the general policies that regulators were responding to. Spectrum. In terms of spectrum, there were 4 key ways that regulators responded, and this is kind of looking at the kind of the overall policies, and I've got a few example countries that I'll quickly talk about here. So the first thing is looking at temporary spectrum, and we saw a number of countries very quickly awarded spectrum to operators on a temporary basis in order to alleviate some of the capacity concerns that mobile operators or fixed line operators who are relying on wireless backhaul had. And just a few examples here. I mean, Ireland, first of all, gave access to 700 megahertz spectrum and to 2100 megahertz and 2600 megahertz bands to operators within, I think, 2 weeks or 3 weeks of the pandemic starting. It was awarded initially for a 3-month period because obviously when this all started, we thought it would all be over within 3 months and everything could return back to normal. But that has been extended several times, and actually over time we've seen that operators have required less and less of the temporary spectrum, and less has been granted to them as networks have adapted. Similarly, in Ghana, the NCA, the authority there, provided 5 megahertz of spectrum to each operator and pretty much immediately at no cost. But effectively, the operators came to the regulator and said, we are going to struggle for capacity especially in rural areas, and they were given 5 megahertz of spectrum at no cost, and it was extended, I think, twice after that. Panama, very similar. They awarded 30 megahertz of spectrum in the AWS bands to enable the operators to put in more capacity. Now, one of the interesting things here is that all of these spectrum awards were for spectrum just to add capacity to existing networks. They weren't designed for there to be significant investments, because, of course, the temporary nature of the spectrum meant that operators wouldn't want to pour lots of money into a network if they weren't sure it would be able to continue to be used. So effectively, this spectrum was designed so that it could be put onto existing networks. In South Africa, again, the intention there was that it was going to be awarded on a temporary basis, and there was a general authorization as well to use TV white spaces, and operators were able to make use of a lot of additional spectrum. However, the operators there did actually start to invest in networks using this spectrum, and at the time when ICASA then sought to withdraw the temporary authorizations, then there's been legal challenges over that, because operators obviously want to keep their investments that they have put together, and that is something that is still ongoing. These are not the only examples, and if you look at the report we've put together for the World Bank, we've given some more interesting, some more and other interesting examples there. The second major way in which spectrum policies changed was looking at technology neutrality. Now, obviously, sitting in the UK or most of Western Europe, we take technology neutrality for granted, but in many countries that is not the case, and especially legacy spectrum awards have very specific conditions over which technology you are allowed to use, specifically 3G or 2G systems and so on. And the start of the pandemic and the calls from operators to allow kind of flexibility in spectrum use often meant that you could add more spectrum to the networks which were suffering. So, for example, in Cape Verde, the regulator allowed a flexibility of use in the 900 megahertz band, which previously was only for use by 2G services, just due to the demographics of the country and the handset capabilities that existed. Then the real demand in Cape Verde was for 3G services. So effectively, operators were allowed to use 3G services on what was previously 2G spectrum. In Tunisia, then actually all spectrum was made technology neutral on a short-term basis, but I believe that has now been extended to be long-term. Again, these aren't the only examples, but it's worthwhile talking just in detail about a couple of them. So that's the second major spectrum policy change. The third area was around auctions. Now, and we'll come on to this in a moment, but one of the things about the timing of this was that a lot of people were starting to gear up for their awards for spectrum to be used by 5G services. And I hesitate to say 5G auctions because obviously, given technology neutrality, it's not necessarily true that the spectrum was all going to be used by 5G. But spectrum awards in the 700 megahertz band in region 1 or 600 in regions 2 and 3, and then in the C band 3500 megahertz, and then millimeter wave spectrum. All of these were starting to happen and had happened in some countries, but there are some places where these were postponed or delayed. There were a couple of countries that actually continued with them, but generally, because of the logistics of actually getting people bidding and so on, then a lot of places postponed them. And a couple of examples here were Austria. Austria was actually due to auction its 700, the 1500 megahertz and 2100 megahertz spectrum in April 2020, but they cancelled that. They deferred it until October 2020, mainly because they believed that the operators needed to concentrate on network management rather than anything else. The other kind of really interesting one here was New Zealand. New Zealand was due to auction the 3500 megahertz spectrum, and instead of awarding that by auction and requiring the operators to bid, they awarded that spectrum on a temporary basis. So, sort of moving it into the first box here until November 2022. But actually, after a couple of months, they made a decision that this spectrum should be used by operators to roll out 5G services and to support a much greater capacity. So what they did was to convert those temporary licenses into long-term licenses via a direct award, and required operators just to pay the reserve price of those spectrum licenses. Now we have obviously seen a number of auctions have happened since the start of the pandemic, and some of the delayed ones have now occurred. We're starting to see moves to different types of award as well. This is a completely different topic which I will not go into here, but it's sufficient to say that there are quite a lot of changes to the way that spectrum has been awarded as a result of the pandemic. And then the last point was around spectrum fees. In many countries, then regulators either did not want to or did not have the ability to change the licenses or award additional spectrum or so on. But what they did notice was that operators were having to invest in different parts of their network and trying to make sure that the networks were sufficiently resilient, and of course this costs money. So what regulators did was to try and alleviate some of the cost of that by either delaying or reducing the fees that were required. So, for example, in Japan, they deferred the collection of spectrum fees specifically for areas in which investment needed to happen. In Malaysia, they effectively cancelled the fees that were due during 2020, I believe, and I think they actually started in 2021, started recharging. And similarly in Argentina, they had a deferment to fees, and actually initially deferred but then cancelled because as long as operators were meeting certain investment targets. And again, all of this was done on a relatively temporary basis, but sometimes things have continued for longer than people initially thought. But hey, as I said, we all expected this to be over within 3 months. And I won't go into too much detail as to kind of why it was that people chose different measures. but let's just say that the context that the decisions were made in was the key to determining what the policy should be. And there's a slightly unfortunate quote from one of the regulators, who I won't name, and we haven't named. He said that COVID-19 came along at the right time. Now, obviously, there isn't a right time for a pandemic, but one of the things that we saw, and as I mentioned, is that lots of countries at the time were starting to award or make plans for their 5G spectrum licenses. And the spectrum was sitting there waiting to be awarded. So you had spectrum that was unused, you had operators who wanted to actually deploy it. So operators were able to make use of temporary spectrum awards or direct awards and so on, very, very quickly. So effectively, operators needed to, so regulators needed to make very quick decisions, and they needed to try and help operators to make their networks resilient. Now, you're not going to be able to read much of this, and to be honest, it's around the colours more than anything else. This is a very interesting chart from OpenSignal, which shows how service quality actually changed over time during the pandemic. And what this does is to try and compare the service quality in each of the countries that's listed. As I said, you can't actually see the countries, but I'll tell you about a few of them in a moment, against the first few weeks of 2020. If a country has a blue colour, that means that the service quality is worse, and the darker the blue, the worse it is. Conversely, if the service is better, then the colour is green, and the darker green it is, the better quality it is compared to the start of 2020. And what you can see here is that in general, you had a lot of countries where there was a worsening of quality initially, but over time that got better, and certainly by the time you got to 2021, then generally things were significantly better. Now, that's not true in every country, and there's a few, such as Japan, where actually the service quality is still worse than it was, and similarly in Singapore, the service quality is worse than it was. And we think that this is largely because they had limited ability to actually make any regulatory changes because of the situation that they were in. But overall, you can see that there was a noticeable fall in quality, but that has generally improved over time. And it's certainly worthwhile, as I said, looking at this in a bit more detail. This is a really fascinating graph that OpenSignal has put together, and seeing what this means. And it does mean that you can kind of pull out some of the countries where we identified quite significant policy changes and see how has that affected things over time. And that comes on to the last question of what can we learn? And unfortunately, one of the things that we always like to try and do is put together kind of a firm recommendation at the end of a project. There is no one correct recommendation here, and all the decisions that regulators need to take and did take have to be based on the market context. It may be that actually more than one policy is appropriate, but you need to obviously be careful as to how they may interplay against each other. The most important thing, so I'm not sure why I was second on this slide, but the most important thing is that the regulators need to communicate with the operators, and there needs to be a constant communication as to how networks are being used, how capacity is being felt, and how demand is being met. So effectively, in order to overcome this problem, there needs to be a very active communication between regulators and operators, and also a monitoring regime to make sure that things are being met as needed. And that's effectively where we got to. I hope that you found this interesting. I know that we've got a few questions. Ord, I don't know if you want to pull them out and ask.
Yes, we do have a couple of questions from Monica on slide 4. Do we expect data demand to be bigger in mobile than in fixed at a point in time in the near future?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, the answer depends on which country you're looking at. And in some countries, especially in most African countries, actually it already is much larger. Mobile demand is much larger. But I think overall, especially when you consider sort of the industrial use of fixed networks, then it's going to take quite some time for mobile to overtake. So I'm not sure if it will actually happen in any particular time. I mean, the other thing to think about is that actually the largest use of data, which I said is video. Although people do watch videos on their phones and using mobile data, the majority of streaming services are done via televisions and other networks, and other network connected devices, which are generally over fixed networks. So it may take quite some time for mobile to catch up with fixed, if it does at all.
Another question is whether we have any information on whether during the pandemic operators increasingly offered fixed LTE.
So the answer is yes, we saw that, and I mentioned it, that one of the things that regulators did was to try and encourage the take up of FWA, fixed wireless access, where people were unable to get a connection. And partially some of the spectrum awards, particularly in places, actually Ireland was one example as well, where some of the spectrum that was temporarily awarded was theoretically for use by FWA networks to increase capacity there.
Okay, a question from Peter. How are different regulators working with operators on spectrum refarming for 5G and for 2G, 3G shutdown?
Oh, so that's a very big question, and it's not really. What's quite interesting is that the technology neutrality temporary measures that came in as part of the as part of the pandemic largely have continued. They were put in as a temporary measure to start with, but they continued afterwards. But to be honest, there's not much that's related to those temporary measures that impacts on kind of the refarming of spectrum. And I suppose the only thing I would say here is that where some of the spectrum awards have been delayed, or where some of the additional spectrum has been made available, then refarming has been taken into account there. But I don't think that there's anything that I particularly want to say about that. Yeah, on this presentation. I think that's a very good question, a very kind of expansive question, but it's not really one that is impacted too much by this kind of temporary spectrum policy.
Okay, thanks. A question from Richard. Do we have any indication as to what caused the increase in mobile data rates after the initial drop-off in March 2020? And Richard asked, were fixed networks less reliable over capacity?
To be honest, the growth in mobile, and I can quickly go back to that graph. The growth in mobile is effectively following the standard growth over time. So there is a growth in demand for mobile, and actually, if anything, it's growing at a slightly slower rate after lockdown. But the thing to remember is that lockdown did not last for months and months and months in many countries. So as people started to go out more or go for their exercise that they may be allowed, or go for shopping trips and so on, then actually more mobile would have been needed. But I think that just generally fixed networks were not generally over capacity. Having spoken to a number of regulators, they said that fixed networks came too close to capacity in many cases, and they did add more capacity to them. But generally, the reliability of fixed was not really a problem.
Okay, and we have another question from Claire. She asks, do you think that any of these temporary measures are likely to become permanent? And in particular, will cooperation among operators to further a specific public interest likely to be viewed more favorably in the future?
Oh, it's interesting. So this is a very, very big question, and I think there are some kind of significant kind of points to be thought about this. And actually, we've done some work looking at the kind of the social welfare question around spectrum policy over time recently. So first of all, to say is that yes, some of the temporary measures did become permanent. The technology neutrality did. The some of the temporary spectrum awards, as I mentioned in New Zealand, that the temporary spectrum awards were made permanent there. There have been some changes to the way that spectrum fees have been collected as well, and there's I'm afraid I can't remember which country it was, but there was one country which has actually reduced spectrum fees by putting, as a result of putting kind of additional obligations onto spectrum users. But the question about kind of cooperation among operators is a very interesting one. And as I mentioned, one of the almost unique things that happened during the pandemic was that competition policy was at times not gotten rid of, but significantly relaxed to allow people to cooperate and collaborate. And I think that regulators probably understand that there is a benefit to this kind of collaboration in terms of serving public interests, increasing social welfare. But they have to be very careful at balancing that against a lack of competition. So as a result, what we may see is that regulators start to intervene a little bit more in terms of allowing cooperation between operators. But you'll end up with making sure that the competition question is not impacted. I hope that answers the question. But as I said, I think on that one and the question about spectrum refarming, these are some very big topics that I would not be able to give a full and robust answer in the time we have.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I just have a question for you because I didn't work on this specific study. I was wondering, because you've talked about measures that some countries took, and I was wondering where, if in any countries, some regulators didn't change their spectrum policies at all.
Yes, I mean, I think in the report we have, then there are sort of 30 examples or 35 examples of where policies were changed. And that's not to say that every other country that's not in the report didn't, but there were certainly countries such as the UK and such as France where they didn't actually make a change to spectrum policy, but that's not to say they didn't look at it. And we're aware from having spoken to Ofcom and to regulators and to RCEP as well, that there was a good communication between the operators and the regulator. And I'm not saying that the operators would have all said to the regulators, oh, we don't need anything. But what they were able to look at is whether there was a kind of a huge need for additional capacity or a huge need for additional spectrum, or if there was a need for financing of new and different investments. And I know that Ofcom and RCEP and a couple of other European regulators as well looked at this in a lot of detail very quickly once the pandemic hit, and concluded that there was no immediate need for a change in spectrum policy, but they needed to keep an eye on it, and you know, they were willing to make changes if any were needed.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I think we don't have any questions anymore.
Great, and I mean we're now at the 45 minutes mark, which is what we're aiming for. So that is quite good timing. And I think it's worthwhile saying that, you know, this, as I said, we put together a report for the World Bank, which will be released at some point in the near future. We spoke to a lot of people all around the world to get some information about how decisions were made and what we can learn. And I think that the last point just to make is that I asked pretty much every regulator, what would you have done differently? And in most cases, in fact 99% of cases, they said they would not have done anything differently because what they did worked out really well. So I think generally it's a good success story, and there are things that we can learn and that we can try and implement, but it's more about making sure that the decisions that needed to be made can be made. So having a framework for the right sort of decision and a framework for kind of regulatory policy in place is kind of the real thing that people need to make sure is done now. But if you have any other questions or any other thoughts, then please do contact me, and all my contact details are there. And we will be doing more webinars like this in the future. I think that it's a good thing to just try and put out some interesting stuff that we are finding during work on other projects. So hopefully we will see you all at some point in the future again. So thank you very much.